Thank you. Welcome everyone to Gallery Myrtis. We are so happy to see familiar faces and welcome new ones. We are here this afternoon, which is a very, very special afternoon for us. We have Dr. Joaneath Spicer from the Walters Museum, and we'd like to welcome her as our guest, and this is the first time she's presenting here at Gallery Myrtis. So a little bit of background on the exhibition that's currently installed here, and then I'll read Dr. Spicer's bio, and then she's going to do a lovely presentation on the exhibition at the Walters, which is Revealing the African Presence in Renaissance Europe, and talk about the parallels between that exhibition and ours, which is Revealing the African Presence in Renaissance Europe, a Contemporary Response. And in our exhibition, we are featuring the works of 8 contemporary artists who are influenced by, inspired by, and responding to the imagery and subject matter that's touched upon in the Walters exhibition. And I liken it to the tradition of African music, where the spirits of our ancestors have been sent forth, this call and response, and the contemporary artists are responding to the imagery, the spirits of their ancestors. And in talking about and informing you of Dr. Spicer's bio and past, she is a recipient of her BA from Smith College and PhD from Yale University. After teaching at the University of Toronto, she came to the Walters in 1990. Her publications have addressed such wide-ranging subjects as Netherlandish painting in Dutch and Flemish drawings from the National Gallery of Canada, art and science at the court of the Rudolf II in Prague, and the role of the visitor in 17th century art collections and in modern exhibitions. To all of you, I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Spicer.
Thank you. I'm really delighted. Is this level about right? Okay. I'm really delighted to be here. This show, Revealing the African Presence in Renaissance Europe, I started actually around 2001, trying to think whether or not, really becoming interested in this subject. Oh, I'm supposed to be standing up here. Yes, I have to follow instructions here. And beginning to think whether or not I could do an exhibition on this subject, because there really had not been one before. There was a number of scholars who worked in this area coming out of European sort of Renaissance studies, but there had never been an exhibition, and there were many factors that would influence that decision, that there were many sort of difficulties, challenges involved with this, not only in finding the material, but when I started working on the subject, trying to propose something inside the Walters, and then it took me a long time to sort of get it on the books, and then to try to place the show elsewhere, encountering a variety of sort of difficulties. So it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful for me that we are the show has opened, that it actually opened, it actually happened, and that it has been a success. And I'm sorry, I can't help myself. You'll have to indulge me for a second. In case you haven't seen it, we got a review on the New York Times on the, above the fold on the Friday article. I don't know that, I'm sure sometime in history there has been a better review than this, but it's, so all the difficulties that I encountered, that's why I take special satisfaction in the response that scholars and audiences have had to this show. And I think an important part of that in terms of response is that I think just as the success with which Amy and Myrtis have encouraged artists to respond to this show. Also, I think a very wide range of people respond in their own way. They may not be artists, but they are responding and associating it with their own lives in one way or the other. That's really what we hope exhibitions do. You know, that great artists, when you're looking at great art of the past, what it becomes important is not just because, okay, that's pretty, that's well done, but whether it somehow enlarges you, you know, in some ways or other. And that's what we hope for as a museum. And also to keep in mind, you know, one of those periods so-called the Renaissance in Europe, it's a period that's quite important in European history in many ways, and continues to be important in American society. And one aspect of it, you know, Renaissance is simply, as I'm sure you're aware, just means rebirth. And after all, what it involves, just as we are, you know, surrounded by examples here today, is that it involved in a very fundamental way looking back to another a vital creative period in the past and drawing on that. In other words, stepping back in order to leap forward, to understanding the roots in order to blossom, as it were. And I think that in an exhibition like this, this is just such a perfect example of how so much of the great art of the past has been generated. You don't do everything absolutely new. By drawing on the past, all the resonances of that art of the past is now sort of absorbed into what you're doing. You're adding a new chapter to a great work of art. You know, artists such as Albrecht Dürer or Veronese or any of the artists in our show are in some sense expanded by a contemporary response today. We understand them better, and I say that very specifically because there are a number of works in this show that my own understanding of them, I can tell you, has been expanded by seeing how artists and other people today respond to them, that they see something slightly different than what I had seen. Yes, maybe we don't want to do that. Wait a minute, where's my little clicker? Here. Oops. One of the basic principles in this show is sort of embedded in the very first work that you encounter when you visit the show, and I think many of you have seen the show, and that here, this is a traditional subject in European art of that period, a Christian art of that period, which is the adoration of the kings, and which you see at this period this growing importance of devotional art, of really making clear the universal nature of the Christian mission, and therefore including one African king as well as a European and an Eastern king. But more important even for us, you know, within this exhibition, and that is not seeing the black king as simply, okay, this is a stock figure, so now we're going to have an African, we're going to include an African, quote unquote, among those worshiping the Christ child, but this is a portrait. Just like this is a portrait, so is this, the Black King's attendants. It has been done on the basis of a careful study from life, so that what we know, if we look beyond, if you see the painting, not simply as a surface, but as a window on the past, and you look through that to the individuals depicted, that we can begin to, much more surely than we have in the past, speak directly to these people who lived 500 years ago and begin to tease out something more about their presence, their ambitions, their contributions to society, and also we will see what is reflected very much, I think, at least in some artists' works in this show, something trying to understand something of their emotional life. I always want to say next, but of course that's instructions to me. This show is divided into two parts, and I'm going to focus primarily on one part, but I want to look at the first part also, which is, the first part is sort of context. At the Walters, we always do context. We're a big context institution, looking at the social, historical, etc. conditions that surround the making of works of art, so that we place them in history. And so the first half of this show is on that sort of context, the context for people of African ancestry in Europe. And then the second half is focusing on the people themselves. And so the exhibition begins, the first section here is on the perceptions of Africa in Europe at this period, for sort of the long 16th century, from the late 15th into the early 17th century. And what we find here, because after all, one's own sense of self is very much influenced by how other people see you. It cannot really be avoided, or you're a remarkable individual if you are not influenced by that. So we want to think about that a bit. And what we find is that certainly in perceptions of Africa, that Africa was so immense, close geographically in some ways, but so strange to Europeans, that we see the kind of ambivalence of this in the art of the time. For instance, in this allegory of Africa, the figure of Africa, it's a very common way at the time to show a female figure as a kind of embodiment of a concept, and then surrounded by attributes or things that enlarge the image. And here she is riding on a crocodile. Well, the crocodile was in a way one of those images associated with Africa at this period. Something so terrifying, so threatening. And you don't tame a crocodile. You know, there are many other things. You can get an elephant to work for you. You can do all kinds of things with all kinds of other animals, but not a crocodile, you know? And so the idea of this, the sometimes terrifying character of this immense continent, the vastness of the Sahara, the intensity of the heat, these are things that are quite hard to grasp. But also, at the very same time, and even in this text, it contrasts the issue of the wildness of the continent with its history, with the concept of the incredible technical achievements of the pyramids, with which Africa was also associated, so that you would see these two dramatically different sides of the continent. We also have, at this time, another fundamental aspect of this context would be the importance of the roles played by Africans in Christian art of this period, and that really does not play a role in this in the exhibition here. So I'm not really going to focus on that much, except to say that besides, we can say very basically that the roles played by Africans in Christian art of the Renaissance is basically the same range as in society itself, which is to say from ruler to servant, the full range, much like everybody else. Very fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of things that are quite interesting here. Not everybody I discover knows about St. Maurice, who was the very idea of the importance of the black saint at this figure in Europe, a period in Europe. So there's a lot that's new here, but this is not really relevant for us. Another basic issue here, which is relevant for us, is the question of color. In the Renaissance, we commonly talk about race today. And there was the word race, certainly in French at that time, but it meant like family, like the race of Henry VIII, King Henry VIII or something like that. It would be the family. It wasn't associated with ethnicity. So we have just used the word color in the show, because that's how they would talk about these issues. And color has two sides at this period. On the one, as you might expect, there is certainly a very strong element of color as a source of prejudice. One of those, and what we try to do in the show, is get those out and look at them. What actually was wrong with black skin? Why would you have prejudice against black skin? Because so often prejudice is one of those things that simply perpetuates itself, and nobody remembers why. Why did you dislike this family or something? Nobody remembers. It just goes on generation after generation after generation. So we just wanted to go back and look at it. Well, there's some very fundamental things at this period that it's good to get out and look at, and sometimes many of them will really make you mad. But there it is. So let's just, one of the basic elements of this is a complete misunderstanding of skin pigment. The assumption in Europe that Adam and Eve were white. Therefore, if human beings were originally white, it means anybody who is not white, that it's discolored, as they would have said. Well, of course, that makes no sense at all to us today, but that was a kind of fundamental assumption. Well, if you believe that, many things will follow from that. Even the word Ethiopian is basically Greek for burnt skin. So there's always the assumption that it started out white. We can only get back to white. There's another basic sort of element here that influences many other aspects of the issue of prejudice, and that is Genesis. In Genesis, the first day of creation, which is what is depicted in this print, which is in the show, as you will recall, what does God do on the first day? He separates light from dark. And light is associated with illumination, dark with night, with ignorance, with chaos, out of which light will emerge, and from chaos to ignorance of God, and it's a slippery slope to hell, Hades, and hell being black, sin being black, and it keeps going. And so what starts out as a symbol sticks, you know, and it's a kind of, it's very dispiriting to see this, but there it is. But just at the same time, and there are many other manifestations of that, but at the same time, one of the things that's so fascinating about this period, which is when there is so much sort of exchange and people just looking at things in sort of new and completely open ways, and that is the development of a black aesthetic in the 1500s. It's something that I find absolutely fascinating, and one of the aspects of all of this in which I have made more of a contribution myself to the scholarly literature. And that up until this time, it's been very popular at the beginning of this period for collectors, and now you have more people actually having art in their homes than you had before. It's not just religious; you have it in your home, and you see that one of the things that they're collecting are creating our small sort of statuettes or figurines in bronze and different materials that are meant to, in some ways, look back to classical antiquity. So it's part of that Renaissance idea that they're trying to be like a Roman collector. Well, one of the aspects of that is that within this group now, you begin to see many artists who naturally work with bronze or black marble or other dark materials, who have just naturally thought of these as absolutely fabulous colors. But you know, the black is a great, if you work in black marble, it's a great material, or onyx, etc. Begin now to want to express the aesthetic achievement of this material through the depiction of African figures, so that we now have, along with such works like this is in the Walters collection, you begin now to have a whole range of other figures that are now of Africans. So this is a very exciting development at this period. And it involves a kind of reassessment in some ways of blackness, which is quite exciting, and which people begin to really to think as well, to think very directly about the aesthetic possibilities, or just think of blackness as an aesthetic choice. Also at this time, we need to think briefly about the situation of social class and slavery. Something to keep in mind, because that's always in people's minds with the background in American history, and that is to think that at the beginning of the period we're concerned with, in the beginning of the 15th century, all the countries around the Mediterranean are all basically slaves economies. They all have slaves. But in Europe, most of the slaves are white at this period. There's a reason why slave and Slav sound very similar, because most of the slaves are Russian, or from the east, and only gradually over time, with the increased trade, the Portuguese trade down the west coast of Africa, does that expand that and to include more Africans. We also have a situation in Europe that it's basically an urban phenomenon. It is not the plantation. They don't have plantations in Europe at this time. So you are basically learning skills in the household, or working in a shop, and that bondage is basically a fairly negotiable situation, because very few people are not freed during their lifetime. So money is set aside. You start your own business or whatever, and go, merge into society as a whole. And this painting done in Lisbon in the 16th century, Lisbon had the highest population of people of African origin in Europe. There was 10% of the population, which is quite a striking number. And in this quite remarkable painting from around the 1560s, this is a part of the city near the port, and the area where people went to get water. Because you didn't have water piped into your houses, mostly you went to public fountains and you got your water there. But in any case, in this painting, about 30% of the people are black, which is quite a remarkable view of European urban society that's, I think, quite striking to many visitors. And one of the things that we find that people are in all different walks of life, doing all kinds of things. Some of them seem to be clearly sort of enslaved, but others are, we have sailors, black sailors on shore leave, etc. And we also have this person who I urge you to look more closely at when you are at the Walters, which I assume you will be again. And this man, we can identify him, although I can never remember his name myself, because I'm not very good at Portuguese names. But in any case, he rose from being a slave at court to being a noble. He's a nobleman. He's a member of the Order of St. James, which we can tell by the insignia on his cape. So that we have a remarkable range of not only of occupations but interactions between groups in that society. We have very few representations of what we would think of as people enslaved, because Europeans weren't really into that particularly. Why? It wasn't really an issue. They were more concerned with the issue of potential being enslaved themselves. Because you might be, if you were captured on the high seas by a North African slave trader, you were going to end up on the market in Algiers. That's what you would be afraid of. So, it's very interesting that the most images of somebody who is actually in chains, they're white. Like Michelangelo bound slaves. because that represented European fears. Actually, the most famous person from this period who narrowly escaped being sent to the galleys to die as a galley slave was the Spanish writer Cervantes, who was captured on the high seas and ransomed at the last moment. But he languished in Algiers for some time before he escaped. But in any case, let's keep moving along. But one of the things I wanted to show here, this little head, which is in the show, which is only like this big, but one of the striking things about this, as well as many other representations in the show, is the expression. It's small, so you have to, look at him. You have to really, to engage with him, you have to really get close, which I urge you to do. And that is that you will see that in so many of these representations, the artist has been so insistent to bring out a sense of the reality and the personality of the person who was the model for this image, and the sense of a kind of sadness, a kind of, it's hard to actually, there are many ways that one might imagine it, but a kind of ambivalent expression in their face of what's going to happen to me, where am I going, and thinking, where have I been? This is absolutely a very striking element of these, which I encourage you to look at in the show. We have one section, then, as we move into the people themselves. We begin with people who are depicted as slaves. And we know that at this period it became, as portraiture became more and more important, which is after all kind of defining quality of this new focus on the individual that the Renaissance is known for. One of the ways, as people try to think of all different ways to depict their status, is that if you were quite wealthy, you might decide at this period to show yourself either with, I don't know, some kind of prized, your prized hunting dog, or your children, but you might also show it with a black slave. As a high, oopsie, what am I doing? As a very high status symbol. And the poster girl for this show, this fabulous portrait here, was originally part of a portrait like that, but the woman here who would have been her mistress, the owner, here you see just her veil and her arm, she's been lost. The picture must have been damaged at some point in the past and had to be cut down. And all that remains is this absolutely fabulous portrait of her servant, shown here holding up this really very expensive clock. So the woman was being owned by her possessions, including this fabulous clock. Well, one of the things about this is this whole question this raises. Let's just go to the next one here. Then one of the issues raised by one of the artists in the show, I think, in a very fascinating way, and I never can quite remember the names. I remember the works of art better than the names, I'm sorry to say. But the series that this represents, you want to tell me?
It's actually part of her Black on Black series.
Yes.
Is Jamia Richmond Edwards, and it's an untitled piece.
Right. The whole issue of invisibility, which I can see some of you nodding here, is this question of people who seem who live their lives in the shadow of others, and how do we tease them out? Have we done that to people? And she told me the whole story behind the series that she did, which I will attempt to completely sort of retell. But it had to do partly with her. Oops, and I'm walking away. With her own family history of how she felt that she had, in some degree, written her own mother out, and sort of acted as if she was invisible because her life the path her mother had taken didn't really, you know, fit her idea of where she herself wanted to be, and the fate of many black women in the past. They were some of the women in this series have actually been killed by a serial killer, and they've been prostitutes, and nobody cared about them. You know, and she wanted to draw them out and sort of memorialize them, but also emphasize, mix that issue of social invisibility with the issue of black as invisible. And I personally think these are really fabulous. This is a fabulous, fabulous series, because how she has drawn these various issues together with such incredible success is, to me, absolutely. What did I do? Technology is not what I do best. Okay, back here. This makes me think absolutely, and also these women's faces, because these are based on photographs that were taken. They were mugshots when the women were arrested. You know, they were killed later, but she went back and got their mugshots from when they had been arrested. I mean, it's incredibly subtle and wonderful what she did. But I'm reminded then very much, aside from these commissioned portraits, like somebody very wealthy who commissions themselves with a richly dressed black child, that the drawings, however, aside from those commissions, these same artists were doing drawings themselves that were only for their purposes. They weren't for anybody else's purposes. They can draw what they want. And the incredibly sensitive drawings that they are doing. This drawing by Albrecht Dürer, who is one of the great portraitists of the Renaissance, a German artist. This drawing has probably never been in the Western Hemisphere before. And after the showing in Baltimore, it will not go to Princeton, to our partner in the show. It will go back to the Uffizi, to Florence again. It's one of the great Renaissance portrait drawings. But aside from the absolute beauty of his execution and the way that he has again used that black or brown material, play with lines in order to try to understand the aesthetic, the forms of her face. What's most striking is his respect for her facial expression. He doesn't try to make her look happy-go-lucky. You know, he doesn't do that at all. He absolutely respects this sense of kind of resignation and sadness in her face, which I think is, which really, you know, I really see a connection with these. And this is a person also who was in service in bondage in Antwerp, where the artist visited, and again would be one of the invisible. Except that Dürer then, through this drawing, it's not just that it's a great drawing, but you know, it establishes her as a person living in Antwerp, you know, a place, I might add, where they didn't actually have the concept of slavery. So if she, which she probably didn't know, if she had gone AWOL, she would not have to have gone back. Her honor could not have gotten her back, but she probably didn't know that. We have a famous case of someone there who did go AWOL, and the owner tried to get him back, and the court system said, we don't have slavery here. We allowed you to bring in slaves. These are Portuguese merchants. We allowed you to bring in slaves because that was the only basis on which you were going to come, and we wanted your trade connections. But we are not going to guarantee your ownership. But she probably didn't know that. One of the sections that I was most interested in myself was the section on free and freed people of African ancestry. What happens when people start shaping their own life? One of the things that I'm very interested in, keeps coming up time and time again with so many different artists here in the show, is how do we present ourselves? What choices do we make when we define ourselves in terms of a image. If you are in bondage, or if you are trying to integrate into a social group, you either don't have any choice, or you're going to try to look like people around you. But as you may sort of move up, as we will see in this show, move up the social chain here, you begin to have many more choices. What choices did they make? Here we have a whole range of people that we find how important that the art may be, we'll find, in terms of sort of teasing out the presence. Oh, some artist here was talking about absence and black absence. I forget who it was on one of these very nice little artist statements. And I thought, oh, what a nice, if I'd only thought of that myself, because we talk about the presence. The African presence in Renaissance Europe. But it might have been very interesting to make a play on absence versus presence. And it's very interesting that the artist picked up on that. When are you both absent and present? You know, you can be both at the same time. You can be present but feel absent. You know? And there can be times when you're absent, but other people feel your presence. You know, so these concepts can flow back and forth. But one of the things that we will find to make to not spend too much time on the some aspects of this, and that is that it was an incredible range. That we are finding them in the countryside. We are finding them or their descendants as artists, as a whole range of different sort of occupations, as teachers, as scholars, as people who have chosen the religious life, as Franciscans, etc. We are also finding them as very wealthy, very successful individuals, and maybe yet we haven't been able to fully clarify their lives, but through their image we're beginning to do so. And then, of course, one of the figures in the show, and I'm just seeing that this display makes everybody look a little fatter and a little shorter than they are. So you have to imagine everybody's a little bit taller and a little bit narrower than they depict here. Alessandro de' Medici, Duke of Florence, which is, after all, quite a nice gig. One of the artists, at least one, maybe more than one, was very interested in this portrait here, which you see, which I mentioned before. A painting, one of those that was totally unknown before this exhibition, never published before. I found it in a private collection in Belgium. And is absolutely riveting to me because both in this gold chain, which would be, you don't commission a chain like that. That's given to you as an expression of high court service, you know. So you wear it with great honor because there's only one way to get that, you know. His cap here, that's the kind of cap that, I mean, houses are cold then, and so you might wear your furs inside, but you also, men might wear a cap also because it's cold. In Northern Europe, and if you're quite wealthy, like his cap here, you will see it with little seed pearls. It's all covered with little seed pearls. So everything we know about him is found in this portrait. We don't have any other document. I think my point of interest was him. I was so proud when I felt like, okay, I think maybe I have found him in another work of art. In a tapestry that represents a wedding at the court of one of the dukes of Saxony. And the figure here is represented, would be in the position that looks like he would be court chamberlain, or something like that. In other words, the person who sort of organizes the court, keeps everything working and running. A very high position, but the kind of position within a court system that it's in the court system where blacks were most likely to rise, because they might not have, if they had been enslaved at some point in their life, they probably don't have the same kind of education that they would have had otherwise. But in the court, where there are lots of jobs that involve really good organizational skills, loyalty and persistence and intelligence, and if you have all that, it's very possible for you to rise, for anybody who is maybe from a disadvantaged background, to rise in a court system. So that's really one of the places that we find them. However, that's not what other people are interested in this painting, both in this show, and we also have an exhibition that of middle school students responding to some works in the show. And this is one of those that caught some of the students' attention. But what we find there in this quite wonderful juxtaposition that's around the corner of a portrait that was done, what seems to be of, I don't know, quite poor man. In any case, a kind of a person who's simply leaning against the wall around the corner here. And what he's picked up on, the artist picked up on, is quite striking and made me go back and look at this painting again. And that is on his sense of interior life. You know, for all his wealth, seeming wealth, that there is a sense of kind of ambiguity in the facial expression. You know, where am I now? Where am I going? Where have I been? You know? That's that's, once I see this, I'm riveted by it. And that this pattern of, no matter what the status is, of there's some sort of inward examination taking place here, is really very moving. The Alessandro de' Medici, the Duke of Florence, according to contemporary critics, his mother was a black slave from one of the Medici households. His father, on the other hand, is even more problematic. His father was almost certainly later to become Pope Clement VII. He's also a Medici. So this is, it's a complicated family. So it's very interesting for somebody who becomes a duke that we don't have a clear birth date for this man. Well, of course, nobody wants to admit where he was even born. So you'll have, you know, so say, oh, well, I think he was born in a Urbino, which would be also far from Florence, but another sort of Medici family sort of stronghold there. Well, almost surely not, but if he's born in Urbino, somehow you could explain, well, we don't actually have the day. In any case, once he had died, he was really a tyrant. He was really a piece of work. We have to tell the truth on this. He's assassinated in 1537. After he's assassinated, then historians and others feel more comfortable about commenting on him. At which point, not only does one historian who has known him in life describe him as black, which they had not dared to do during his lifetime, but also we have this portrait, which is in the show, which is fabulous, by a very important artist. His name's Bronzino, but this portrait has always been disregarded because it was said, oh, well, it was done after his life, after his death. It can't be from, you know, life. But the point is, all the portraits during his life are all ones that he commissioned. Well, they are what we today would call airbrushed. At least that's how I see them. I have had really very serious disagreements with some of my colleagues about some of these who feel in other words, that a portrait, as a general principle, if you have one work of art that is very precisely done and another one that is very loosely done so that you can hardly see the detail, you can't go from loose to precise. You know, you're not going to have a precise copy of a loose painting because, you know, you go the other way. So these other portraits are very, very loose, or also he has a cap on, or it suddenly, you know, sort of, in deep shadow or something like that. Or it's just everything's painted in ways that are not characteristic for the artist. So this, because it was later, they said, well, this can't be, you know, a good document. And it's never been on view. But to my mind, it's part of a series of family portraits. They're small, they're for family, sort of family records. But this is the key document because we know that he had access to a very good drawing from life, you know, that was done during his lifetime. So now he has nothing to fear. Why not just depict him as he is? So this portrait, which was done after Alessandro's death, in my view, is the authentic image. At which point, for those scholars who say there is no evidence that he had any African ancestry, I would say, you know, here, can we just close the issue? Can we just close that? And which he now hangs next to our portrait by Pontormo, who's another very good portrait of the time. And here we have Maria Salviati, who's a member of the Medici family. And this is her ward. It's not her own child, it's her ward, Giulia de' Medici. Giulia is his illegitimate daughter. Now, it's a really fascinating story, and when you are in the show, you will go to the resource center, and there you will see a whole discussion of the painting. Was at one point the child was painted out, and you will see a discussion of that. It's not maybe what you think, it's maybe not what you think. I know what you're thinking. But everyone, my colleagues will also say there is no evidence that this is this man's daughter. Now, and says that she doesn't look like him at all. This is a white child. I would say, okay, they're hanging next to each other, please. So the show is meant to do in many ways is that they're to kind of gently take many people by the hand, as it were, and help them to see this African presence in Renaissance Europe, sort of step by step. But here we have a real question of self-representation. How he's wearing a bit of sort of armor. He wants to be a military. He's showing himself as a military man. Okay. How do you present yourself? Here's just a detail of a little medal he commissioned during his life, probably the one that she's holding here, and he makes himself look like a Roman emperor. So the hair changes character considerably. So it's very interesting to see all the different ways that people manipulated their imagery. One of the striking set of images of that character has to do then with the section on diplomats and rulers. I'm really struck as I'm, here thinking around the room here, even from what I can see here, on all the different ways then the artists in this show have played off the issue of both conformity and difference. Here we see this coming out quite strikingly also because diplomats, there were a lot of African diplomats in Europe. We have already, in the 1480s, is the first royal embassy from the Congo to come to Lisbon in 1484. And you have a whole series of them, the Congo, Ethiopia, Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt are the countries in which you have the most active diplomatic engagement, trade relations, negotiations, etc. Taking place. Now, on the other hand, so diplomats came to Europe. They could commission portraits while they were there. They could define themselves any old way they wanted. They're very high status figures. And when their presence in Europe obviously Should I be using this or?
Yes.
Oh,
Recording.
Oh, I see. I usually think people can hear me well enough. Their presence would have an outside impact on people's, of white Europeans' concept of Africa, because they were such high status and so public in their presence. But you would also have people of African ancestry, rulers, who did not come to Europe, but who, one way or the other, they either sent their portraits to Europe, or portraits of them were commissioned for European collections. And it's very interesting to see these, because we see then the beginning of really this assertion of cultural difference in a very interesting way. On the screen here, for example, these two portraits right here, both of monarchs of Africa, whose portraits were commissioned for the great collection of portraits of famous men and women for the Medici, again, the Medici family in Florence. And you have, this is the Sultan of Egypt, which is included partly to remind us that certainly in the Renaissance they were very aware that Africa was a multi-ethnic society. And so the sultans of Egypt were functionally white. They were almost all, it's a sort of curious situation in Egypt, the Mamluk dynasty, in that the only way to become sultan, what Mamluk means, it's not a family name, it means basically purchased. You can only become sultan if in fact you had been first a slave. And they were white slaves from the east, again, these eastern slaves. So they went out and purchased a cohort of boys, usually Christian. Then they are forcibly turned into Muslims, raised to be a military elite, and from there, from that cohort, one would be chosen to become the sultan. So that in fact, if you were an ordinary, maybe wealthy, maybe very successful Egyptian, you had no chance of becoming sultan. A couple of sultans tried to put their sons in place after them, but no such luck. So it's a quite curious system. But in any case, the other one that we have here is Dawit III. Dawit, Emperor of Ethiopia, is one of the most important individual figures in this whole exhibition because of the prominence of Ethiopia in the European imagination. The antiquity of the Christian church in Ethiopia was well known in Europe, and of course was the subject of great admiration. Already by 1500, in Italian libraries, they were collecting Ethiopian manuscripts. And it was the beginning of a kind of almost area studies in Europe. The Ethiopian studies really starts in the 1500s. But Dawit himself, who had then correspondence with the king of Portugal and also with the Pope, was seen as one of the great Christian rulers of the time. So he plays an important place in this show. We also have then this remarkable painting in terms of then presentation. This painting was executed in Ecuador, which will be a little bit surprising to people. But it is from the end of the 16th century, and this is Don Francesco de Arabe. We know who he is. He nicely put his name on here, along with his sons. And this painting, he is the headman of a community of escaped African slaves who have established their own societies, intermingled and intermarried, formed societies with Indian communities there. And he has begun a diplomatic initiative to the King of Spain, who is after the conquest. Spain is now rules much of South America. wanting his two sons confirmed as his successors. So he sends they send a portrait of him along with this diplomatic initiative in order to give, obviously, a kind of substance and presence to this request. It's a great big painting. It's absolutely sort of remarkable. Here, this man, these people of African origin here, how have they presented themselves at this moment of sort of really important diplomatic moment for them? First of all, one of the things that you will notice, and more when you see the painting in the flesh, is that they have chosen some aspects of Europe. First of all, they've used a European form, so that will be easily recognizable to the King of Spain. But the costume, first of all, the collar. That collar, starched, iron collar, that's not very comfortable to wear. Nobody chooses that just for its comfort. So here they are defining themselves by a specific aspect of European costume, sort of framing the face with this. So in other words, to be acceptable, to fit in with court culture, with decorum. But at the same time, what's this jewelry? What's this jewelry? Gold jewelry. This is not European jewelry. It's not African jewelry either. If you can imagine that if you, I'm stepping along over the line here. Do you know where the word deadline comes from? No, do you know where the word deadline comes from? No. I think I'm right in saying this because I think of that every time I think of a line. At Andersonville prison during the Civil War, in somewhere in the South where Union soldiers were, they didn't really have fences. I mean, they didn't have any money for fences. And this is, and so there is a line drawn, and if you step over it, you're shot. So I always think of that when I'm trying to, I've got a deadline. All right, sorry. In any case, you can imagine that if somebody has been